morning, good evening, hello, good afternoon, wherever. I'm Heather Morris, author of The Tattooist of Auschwitz and Silke's Journey. I'm going to just pause here as I deal with this technology called Facebook and live events. And once again, as my counter's not working, let's go now. Hello, good morning or good evening. I'm Heather Morris, author of The Tattooist of Auschwitz and Silke's Journey. I'm delighted to be coming to all you folks there in the UK and having a chat to you about my books. First of all, let me please acknowledge and thank those wonderful indie booksellers. In particular, of course, Booker, Forum, Bookish, Lingham, those people who are responsible for inviting me to have this chat with you this evening, your time. Can I tell you, it's 5 o'clock in the morning, my time. And I'm not normally a morning person, but bear with me and we'll get through this. The Tattooist of Auschwitz. I've been asked the question, how did I get this story? There's a little lesson here for us all. It's only a simple one, and it boils down to saying yes, unless you have a damn good reason not to. I said yes to catching up with a friend I hadn't seen for several months, and she'd been pestering me, come on, catch up, have a coffee, and so we did. It was December, close to Christmas. Now, during that coffee get-together, she just casually said to me, oh, by the way, I have a friend whose mother has just died, and his father has asked him to find somebody he can tell a story to. That person can't be Jewish. You're not Jewish. Do you want to meet him? My friend was Jewish. I said, well, what's his story? And she said, I don't know. I said, never mind, I'd love to meet him. And so I agreed to meet Lali Sokolov because I had a cup of coffee with a friend, finally, and I said yes to meeting a complete stranger. There's a third component in my telling this story, and I'll get round to them shortly. A week later, I knocked on the door of 87-year-old Lali Sokolov. His head was bowed. It was clear from that first instant that he was a man grieving terribly. He was guarded on either side by two dogs. One of them was the size of a small pony. Her name was Tootsie. And the other was, well, smaller actually than my cat. And that was Bam Bam. He just muttered the word come to me and turned around, and he and the two dogs, or doggies, or kiddos as he called them, they just walked back inside. And so I followed, shutting the door behind me. We walked into an immaculate lounge dining area, and he pointed to a table and just said the word sit. So I sat. He and the doggies disappeared. A few minutes later he came back, the doggies too, and he gave me the first of many, many, many bad cups of coffee. But he didn't ask me would I like a coffee. He didn't ask me how I wanted my coffee or liked it. He presented a lukewarm, very pale imitation, I thought, of coffee to me, and a plate that held 6 wafer biscuits. Now, these biscuits are something which, one of the few store-bought biscuits I remember from my childhood, and here he was presenting them to me. And they remain my favourite, and only yesterday I bought a packet of them for my grandchildren. Anyway, I digress. He sat down. The doggy sat down, and the next words he said to me were, did you know I was the Tetevera? Now, he had the most delightful Eastern European accent. I had to answer no to him on 2 counts. I didn't know he'd been the Tetevera, and I didn't know what a Tetevera was. He explained, I was the Tetevera, the tattooist in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And from there, that first time we were together, he pretty much just rambled, he waffled on. You know, he slipped in and out of English, and I would find myself listening to, I think, German or Russian or Slovakian. as this grieving man tried to tell me his story in one go on that Sunday afternoon in 2003, December the 3rd it was. After about 2 hours, and I never interrupted, I just sat listening to him. I said to him, "Thank you very much. I've loved being with you, and can I come back? I'd like to see you again." He said, "Well, when?" And I went, "Well, when would you like me to?" He said, "Well, tomorrow." He said, "You need to hurry up." Oh, is there a problem? Do we have to be somewhere? And that was the first time I think he actually truly looked at me and he said, "I need to be with Gita." I got the message. I agreed to come back in 2 days' time on a Tuesday afternoon after I finished work. I worked full time, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. And I did. On Tuesday after work, Thursday after work, Sunday afternoon again. And for several weeks, I visited him in his home. I sat there drinking his bad coffee and listening to him tell me stories that there was no coherency, they didn't weave together. He didn't have that capacity at that time. Always being greeted with, "Have you written my book yet?" And I would always say to him, "No, Lally, and by the way, I'm not writing a book, I'm writing a screenplay." Well, that just went through to the wicket keeper, as we would say. And then he would follow up with, "Well, hurry up and finish it because I need to be with Gita." This went on for about, three months, I suppose. And we were getting to know each other a bit better and he was engaging with me a little bit better. But every now and then he would say something or start to say something and then he'd pull back. And I knew that, okay, there's something blocking him. And of course, it was obvious. He didn't really know me. How could he trust me when he didn't really know me? And it was those deep personal aspects of his story that he was withholding from me. So one Sunday afternoon, I said to him, "Have you got anything for dinner?" He said, "Oh, some soup left over from last night." I said, "Well, would you like to come home and have dinner with me?" And he went, "Okay." So I put him in my car and drove him home. Introduced him to my husband and 3 young adult children and popped him in the lounge room with the kids to have a chat and went to help the hubby make some dinner. And I heard that afternoon or early evening a sound I'd not heard before, the sound of Lally giggling. And I looked around into the lounge room and there he was sitting on the sofa with my then 18-year-old daughter, and he was openly flirting with her. I remember just smiling and going back to cooking dinner, and we had this amazing evening. And then I took him home and I said to him, "Hey, what was going on between you and my daughter?" And he said, "Yes, very pretty girl." And I went, "Uh-huh, and?" And he put his head down. He said, "She the same age Gita was when I met her." Well, didn't I feel like a heel? Of course she was. And he was transported back to being with another 18-year-old girl. Well, only a matter of a week or so later, the third component that I mentioned in my getting this story happened. Those 2 doggies, Tootsie and Bam Bam, whenever we sat down, which was every time we went there, of course, they would come one at a time and bring to Lally a tennis ball. He would take it from their mouth, throw it over his shoulder, and they would chase after it. And, Tootsie always won, but, Bam Bam never gave up trying. But then one day Tootsie came up with the ball, and Lally went to take it out of her mouth, and she growled at him. He kind of smacked around the ear a little bit, and "Naughty Tootsie, give me the ball." Tootsie growled again. And then Tootsie went and put her head on my knee. I reached down, put my hand in her mouth around the tennis ball, and she released it. I threw it over my shoulder. The 2 doggies went and fought for it. Tootsie won. In that moment, Lally and I both watched them this time. And then Lally turned to me and went, "My doggies like you. I like you. You can tell my story." And from that moment, that was when he broke down, is probably about the best way to describe it. Because that was the point that he then started telling me those deeply emotional parts of his story, the horror, the evil that he had witnessed. It was one thing for him to be clinically telling me what happened and what went on in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Quite another thing to actually telling me about his place, walking through that camp, being in that camp, seeing what he saw. And of course, that was the part to him and the part to me that was the story. Here he was now telling me about this young girl. I knew about Gita. He told me clinically about, I made the number on her arm. Now he's telling me about that moment that he made the number on his arm. He called it numbering. He didn't call it tattooing. He made the numbers, he would say. And he told me about getting typhoid and then being selected or chosen by Pepin to be his assistant, and what it was like for him being in that block that night when he came to and started regaining consciousness, having been out for, he said, 6 or 7 days. He couldn't remember. And how the men told him what they had been doing to keep him alive. That too was so hard for him to tell me, because other men, brave, they were boys, most of them, they risked their life to save his life. And now Pepin was risking his life to save his life. And Pepin subsequently disappeared, and that left Lully in the role of Tetevera. Now I'm going to presume a lot of you will have read the book, so I'm not going to talk about the book so much as talk about, getting the story like I am. Well, after a few weeks, Lully rang me one day at work. He had my number, he had my phone home number, my mobile number, my work number, and he would call me whenever he felt the need. He rang me up and he said, would I go out with him? And when I asked where, what are we doing, he said, it's time. And by that he meant it was time for him to reconnect with the Jewish community here in Melbourne that he'd pulled away from. Since Gita's death, he had only really engaged with a couple of his really closest friends. He hadn't gone out socializing like he and Gita had done all their 60 years of being together. They were quite social animals. Trust me, the photos I've seen of the two of them dressed in their finest, going out to dances and social events, is an amazing life they had. So one Sunday afternoon, about 2 weeks later, I picked him up and drove him. By the way, I drove him because I only ever let him drive me once. The first time I suggested to him that we go out for coffee, we actually go out. I felt the need that I wanted something that I could drink and enjoy. And he drove me once and once only. My life was too precious, I decided. So I drove him to the event. We arrived and we watched as people were heading into this building. It was actually the Holocaust Centre here in Melbourne. Upstairs, they have a function room, and we were going there. We went up there after he had determined the majority of people had already arrived, because Lully wanted to make an entrance. Here was the Lully of old coming back. And we walked into this room, and there was probably close to 200 people in the room. And it was a room of people of the age and of the time where the men were on the left and the women were on the right. And Lully stood at the front as they turned around and saw him and squealed out his name. And like an actor on stage at the end of a performance, he bowed. "Lully is back," he announced. He then pointed to me and he go, "She my girlfriend. You ladies, you look after her. I pick her up on the way out." And promptly sent me off to go and join the ladies. Well, to me, that was probably the best thing he could have done. Because here now, I got to spend time with all these beautiful, lovely ladies, many of whom also had been in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And from that first time that I met with them and they gathered around me, "Who are you? What are you doing? Why are you with Lully? Are you really Lully's girlfriend?" As all these questions came at me. And I answered them about how I was writing his and Gita's story. Well, to them, what can they tell me? They started telling me, of course, not only about Gita, which was wonderful to hear, because these ladies had known her for decades, but then they started telling me also bits about their time in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and I'm starting to get a picture here of what it was like for the women, the girls. And after, I remember glancing over occasionally at Lully, and he'd be over there with surrounded by huge groups of men at all times, talking up a storm, looking at my way, and clearly telling his friends and these other gentlemen who I was and what I was doing. And he would throw me a wink every now and then. And that became the first of many amazing times out with him. Getting his story, trying to put it together, given that I never had any recording material with me for probably 6 months. Just listened. Didn't write anything down, no pen and paper, no phone going with the record button. I knew that he needed to feel confident and trust me to hear his story, not be distracted by writing anything down. A couple of times I did interrupt him and say, but what do you mean by that? Or tell me about that. And he'd get cranky with me. He needed to tell his story his way, and not being interrupted was the only way he could do that. He would lose his thread. You got to remember, he was 87 years of age and still very grief-stricken. After that first time, by the way, that we went out, I noted the next time I came back to see him, and he said the words to me, "Have you finished my book yet?" And I went, "No, Lully, and remember, it's a screenplay." He never said the next sentence, "Hurry up, I need to be with Gita." It was as if he now had a purpose for talking to me and staying alive to see his story told. I've mentioned a couple of times that I said to him I was writing a screenplay. Well, I was doing that because I actually had no idea how to write a book or to write a story. And I had only for about 6 or 12 months prior to meeting him, I'd started, and my friend knew this, I'd started studying or learning, and whatever the appropriate word is, how to write a screenplay. I love movies, and well, I'd got to that point in my life where my children had stopped saying to me, "Hey, Mum, can you take me somewhere?" It was now, "Hey, Mum, can I have your car keys?" And so I had that time on my hands because my children were now young adults. What did I want to do? I'm going to movies. I love movies. How about I write the next great movie? I thought I could. And so workshops, weekend seminars, online courses, I was doing them to write screenplays, and I love the idea of writing a screenplay. And for anybody out there who is thinking about wanting to write, and I've said this to many people I talk to, including students at schools doing English, creative writing courses, learning how to write a screenplay comes with it a set of rules, a very clear set of rules. There's a formula to it, and you follow those rules. You do not deviate, unless you're Quentin Tarantino, which of course none of us are. But by following the rules, you learn how to develop and write Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, and what's got to be in those acts, and the emotional arcs needed. And to me, that was clear, precise. So I'm writing a screenplay. One day he finally said to me, when I'd mentioned, "No, it's a screenplay, Lully." It was probably 12 months after I had been writing and spending time with him. But you've got to also remember that my time with him wasn't just always about hearing his story. It was being his friend, because we were now friends. And then one day he said to me, "Well, what's a screenplay anyway?" I went, "Lully, it's I want to see your story as a film, so I can write it as a film." Well, didn't that get him excited? "A movie? You want to write a movie about me?" I went, "Yeah, I do, Lully." He went, "Well, who will play me?" Well, I wasn't expecting that. "Well, I don't know, Lully. We haven't got there yet." And he looked around and he went, "Brad Pitt. You get me Brad Pitt. He's a good-looking boy. I'm a good-looking boy." Well, I pointed out to him that, Brad Pitt was actually too old already to play you, because you were just a young man in your early 20s. Well, to him, he had to find the perfect person to play Lully Sokolov, didn't he? And the only way we could do that was by going to movies. Well, it helped immensely that said daughter, she worked at a movie theatre. Well, it was a large complex. She was studying, but that was her evening and afternoon job at the movie complex. perfect excuse to see her again. And we started going to every new release movie. Every person I pointed out to him, he would just shake his head, roll his eyes, and go, "What were you thinking? He not like me." One day, we finally got to see a movie who I thought the perfect person to play Lally Sokoloff was acting in. The American actor James Marsden, tall, dark, and handsome. Just like you, I told Lally. Just like you. So off we trot, and we sit down, and Marsden comes on the screen, and Lally just looks at me as I dig him in the ribs and say, "What about him?" And I get the proverbial, "What are you thinking?" But about 10 minutes later, Ryan Gosling comes on the screen. Now Lally is on his feet, and he's yelling out, pointing to the screen, "That's me! He should be me!" I pull him down and shush him. A few minutes later, he's back on his feet. "You down the front, you turn around and look at me. Don't you think he looks like me? You over there." Well, I'm trying to shut him up, and somebody in the audience, and it was a full theatre, it was a new release, they slow clapped him. And then everybody else joined in, giving him a slow clap. Now, you and I interpret that mean as, "Shut it, mate." No, to Lally that meant they totally agreed with him. And he goes, look, they agree. He looks like me." So we got him to finally sit down and shut up. And we all got to enjoy the beautiful movie, The Notebook. Ryan Gosling was the person chosen to play Lally Sokoloff, by Lally Sokoloff. Well, of course, he's too old now too, isn't he? So this was how my life with Lally was going. And then one day I had a script. I had a 110, 112-page standard formatted script. I gave it to him. It was actually his birthday. And I was sitting with him and his son, and he's reading the book, and he's all flipping through the pages, just running his hand over his and Gita's name. And yes, we're drinking his bad coffee, and he'd bought a cake from the local deli. You know, at one point, and I don't often tell this bit of the story, his son, a man in his 40s, he reached over and he said, "Let me read it," and he snatched it out of his hand. And so he's looking through it, and Lally and I are chatting. And at that one point he said, "Oh, Heather, there's a scene in here you have to take out. I can't have anything in my parents' story that's not true." And I went, "Okay, I get that. You know, I'll take in a bit of creative license here and there." I said, "Show me the scene, and if it's not accurate, then of course it's gone." He showed me the scene. I started reading it, immediately recognized what scene it was, turned around and gave it to Lally, and I said, "Here, Lally, have a read." He started reading it, and his head started going down. And I went, "Lally, is it true?" And he just nodded yes. I said, "Lally, do you want me to take the scene out of your story?" And he shook his head no. Well, at that point, his son stood up, gave him a little clip around the head, and said to him in the most indignant voice, "How could you? How could you sleep with my mother before you were married?" He was reading the scene when Lally and Gita were intimate in a death camp, and for him it was all too much. I can kind of get it. As he stormed off to get something stronger to drink, Lally finally looked up to him and went, "You had to be there." Good boy, putting your kid in his place. So he did get to read the screenplay. Because I've been asked by many people, he died, how can he approve of the story you've written about him? Well, because he did approve of it. He read the screenplay, not just that draft that day, but many, many drafts. I had a production company here in Melbourne option the screenplay off me, and they did attempt to make it into a feature film without success. But they too were working with Lally and getting that more information. And oh, didn't he love that? Didn't he love all the attention of a film producer and director, and particularly the producer's wife? He was another lovely young woman for him to flirt with. But yes, sadly he never got to read the book. But I can tell you that the book is my adaptation of my screenplay. That's exactly how I wrote it from the screenplay. Because as I said, I didn't know how to write a book. And I had to do the best I could. And I was so grateful that I had amazing publishers who, after having said to me, okay, we'll give you a go. You have a go at it. And this is the way you write historical fiction. Oh no, initially they told me it's a memoir. Write it as a memoir. Well, I went to memoir school, didn't I, for a day. It was a 5-day course because I knew after that first day that this was not the way I wanted to tell this story. And so they gave me clear license. Write your story. So I wrote it in Lully's words, and that's what you have. And of course, from there, it's gone out around the world. I mean, hey, how lucky am I? I write one book at the age of 65. Yeah, I'm putting it out there. That was 2 years ago, by the way. I've moved on from that age. I don't think I'm going to count this year. It's not been a good one, has it? Well, the last few months anyway. But the book's out there, and it's in 55 countries. And I think 47 of those countries it's translated into a foreign language. The story of Lully and Gita. Not the story of the Holocaust. That's not what I wrote. I just wrote a Holocaust story. And it's out there for people, young, old, anyone to read. And it is being read by young people. It's being read by, well, the youngest who has written to me is 9 years of age. Not sure I'd let my 9-year-old read it, but there you go. A 9-year-old, one at least, has read it and written to me to tell me what she thought of it and to thank me. And it's now in the UK and in Australia and New Zealand. We have a young adult version, so it's even being read now in schools, particularly here in Australia. And that's what I spent a lot of my time doing, is now going to schools and talking to the students who have read the book and discussing it in more detail. You know, a young boy, I think, was he in year 8, so probably 15, maybe 16, no, 14, 15. His school I went and spoke to, and his school sent to me a document that he wrote, and it's a monologue. And it's a monologue that he's written of Boretsky, Stefan Boretsky, Lully's SS Minder. Brilliant piece of writing as this young boy has gone into the mind of Boretsky and written this monologue of this Boretsky now out of Auschwitz-Birkenau, trying to reconcile with himself what he did there. Truly inspiring and amazing piece of writing. I've gone off track a little bit here, haven't I? I do have some questions here from some of you, and I'll just go and deviate over towards some of them before I start talking about Silka. There's a good chance I've actually answered several of them, because how can I talk about Lully without talking about him and I and getting his story? But let me have a quick glance at what you've written. Now, to do this, by the way, I have to put glasses on. So just bear with me for a sec. I'll have a quick glance. Why did he wait so long to tell his story? Yeah, I haven't told you that, have I? Well, it was simple, really. Gita would not talk about their time to anybody. She would not discuss it with anybody. She got on and lived her life with that part of her life being not for public consumption. And Lully had to honour her wish not to talk about it until she died. And so it was her death that had him reach out and say, I need to tell my story, and I need to tell everybody about this young girl whose arm I held, dressed in rags and her head shaven, unbathed. And here he is 60 years later telling me, and I knew in that second I could never love another. By the way, Lully confessed to me, I think it was not long after he had met my family, that he, in fact, prior to going into Auschwitz-Birkenau, had been a playboy, a love him and leave him type of character, living the best life he could in Bratislava. Many, many girlfriends he told me he had. I loved them all, and I was in love with none of them until I met Gita. So doesn't it make it all the more incredible that this playboy could fall for this young girl with the dark, dark brown eyes, nearly black, and that second know that he could never love another? So to answer that question, yeah, it was Gita and her unwillingness. And I think if you read in the back of my book, you'll read from their son his afterword where he says the same thing, how his mother wouldn't talk to him. And he had to learn so much about his parents and their time there from reading my screenplay and then reading, of course, the manuscript. So there's that one. What else have we got here? Let me see. How difficult was it for me to write these terrors? Yeah. That's an interesting part of getting a story like this, is the effect it actually can have on the person doing the listening. I worked in the social work department of a large public hospital here in Melbourne. Every day for over 20 years, my time was spent dealing really with tragedy and trauma, with not patients so much as their family members and their friends, and helping them. And that is why I knew how to take my time, by the way, listening to Lally, and how not to push him. But there's something that can happen when you do spend prolonged periods of time with somebody hearing these painful stories. And it's called transference. And that's when that pain and trauma can leave the person doing the telling and transfer onto the person listening. And yes, it did happen to me, and I wasn't aware of it initially, and I should have been. Golly gosh, this is what I spent my days doing. But I didn't spend my days talking in such detail and was for so long with somebody. And to me, of course, the Holocaust was something that I knew very little about, and hearing the horrors about it from someone who had lived it for nearly 3 years. I didn't realize until my children and my husband was saying to me when I came home from being with Lally, "How's Lally? How's he doing?" And I had reverted from telling them excitedly about him to merely saying the words, "He's fine." Moving on, not wanting to say anything more. And I was with a colleague at work one day when Lally rang, and she was in the room while I had a quick conversation with her, and said to her afterwards, "I've got to go and see him. I don't know, I just not in the mood. I can't do that tonight." She said, "What's going on?" I said, "Oh, look, it's just, starting to weigh me down." She looked at me, of course, and probably rolled her eyes, and then kind of slapped me around a bit and said, "Oh, for goodness sake, Heather, you're suffering from a classic case of transference. Get over it. Remember, this is not your pain. This is not your trauma. You don't get to own it. Now find a way to help him tell his story and for you to hear it and tell it in return." She's right, wasn't she? Not mine. So yes, I went through that period, thankfully not for very long, and found my way of being able to cope and deal with hearing Lally's story. For me, it became quite simple. I would drive away from him after him leaning over his balcony, waving me goodbye, and literally drive around the corner into the next quiet street and just sit quietly by myself. 10 minutes, that's all it took. And just center myself. Leave Lally, leave Auschwitz-Birkenau behind. And then, sometimes I listened to some music, but after 10 minutes or so, I then felt, okay, I can go home now and be the wife and the mother that I need to be, and be able to enthusiastically tell him what Lally had gotten up to and what my time with him had been like. So yes, it had been difficult, but I got through it, didn't I? Because that smart colleague of mine smacked me around a bit. All right, what's next? When you finished the books, did you miss the characters and their lives? No. Well, when I finished Lally's story, I'd written it as a screenplay, and he's still in my life. So how could I miss him when he's in my life? And that was, by the way, the difference between writing his story and writing Silke's. In writing his story over the 3 years that he was with me, whenever it did get too much for me, I could just go to him and say, "Come on, can we just go out for coffee? Can I just sit with you? Can we go for a walk? We'll walk the dogs," which we did a lot, by the way. And he could comfort me, and he could tell me when I would tell him what was bugging me about his story. He would just say, "I'm here, aren't I? Who won? Who won that war?" Gita and I won it. Everybody who walked away from there, we won it because we're still alive. And that was the whole thing about being a survivor, that many of them did consider that they won that war. Of course they did, didn't they? They survived. Those others didn't. But in telling Silke's story, I didn't have that, did I? And so once again, it was to my family and friends that I had to get the comfort because, you know, reading about her time in a gulag and what it would have been like for her being in a gulag, that was way different to anything I knew about surviving in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Once again, even hearing her story from Lali and from others who knew her in Auschwitz-Birkenau, I had them there and I had all now my knowledge about that place to be able to place her in it. Do I miss Lali? Every day. Every day. Why? Well, for 3 years, he was as intensely part of my life. And of course, because of him, I now get to chat to you. I now get to travel the world talking about him and Gita and the others. So of course I miss him. And there's a picture of him behind me. It's on him and I together. I actually only have the one picture, but it's behind me on that bookcase, but it's probably a bit small for you to see. Let me see what else you want to know from me. Let's have a look. Was I surprised about how popular the book was? Heck yeah! You know, initially when I was writing this story, and by the way, I decided to write it as a book because the screenplay wasn't going anywhere, was it? And I was visiting my brother and sister-in-law in San Diego, California, and complaining about, you know, those buggers 100 miles up the road in Hollywood who didn't know a good story if it hit them over the head. And my sister-in-law, perhaps she'd heard enough of me for years going on about it, she just looked at me and she said, "Oh, for goodness sake, write the thing as a book and get on with it." Well, that was a light bulb moment, wasn't it? Okay, I'll give it a go. So in writing his story as a novel, my intention had been to self-publish, print 100 copies, and give them away to friends and family. Why was I still, 10, 12 years later, persevering with this story? A simple answer to that one. I was with Lali the day he turned 90, drinking his coffee and sharing his cake. 3 days later, he had a massive stroke. I was with him for 2 hours alone, just him and I, a matter of hours before he died, knowing that he would not get to see the sun come up the next day. And the last thing I said to him, the last words I said to him when I kissed him goodbye, was that I will never, ever stop trying to tell your story. And so I've been trying to keep this promise, and I think I have, because it's out there. So that was why I had to persevere and tell his story. It was a promise to a man who died a matter of hours later. Do I miss the characters? Am I surprised by how long and how well the book's done? Yes, absolutely. But thank you to everyone who has either bought the book or read the book online, borrow it, I don't mind. But if you can, please remember those incredible bookstores, those indie bookstores, of which there are so many in the UK, and many of which I have visited. Come on, you know them. I'll say their names again. Booker, Lingham, Forum, Bookish Books. Order them online if you can't get into their stores. I'm not sure if your bookstores are open yet. We're all in a crazy time, aren't we? But go to them, and there you can order and buy The Tattooist of Auschwitz and Silke's Journey. And I'll get around to another book in a little bit. Let's see some more questions. What would you have said if you had the chance to meet Silke? Oh my goodness. You know, I don't think anyone's asked me that question before. What would I say to her? I think I would have to say the words that Lali said to me. You are the bravest person, not the bravest girl, but the bravest person I have ever heard about, or in Lali's case, the bravest person he ever knew. Come on, she was a girl, just a girl, 16 years of age, from a protected, beautiful family, in Sabinov in Slovakia when she was taken. Just turned 16 a month earlier. To survive the way she did in Birkenau. And I don't pull any punches. I won't use the words that many of the survivors who knew her and knew about her in Auschwitz, when I asked the ladies, the women, and a couple of the men here in Melbourne, survivors, what can you tell me about Silke? And they would often just shake their heads and drop their heads. And the women would use the words, she was the commandant's girlfriend. Well, she wasn't his girlfriend. She was his sex slave. He was raping her. There is no other way to describe what she endured. She was being raped. Why did she put up with it? Well, she told Lally, I need to survive. And this is the only way I can do it. And he had to warn her, you don't get to say no. The day he shook his head and hung his head and tears welled up in his eyes, and he told me of the worst thing he ever had to do in his entire life was say to a young girl, the only way you can survive is by not saying no, by rejecting this brute of a man who was forcing himself on her. So Silke, the bravest person Lally ever met, the bravest person I have ever heard of, to not only survive Auschwitz-Birkenau, but then 10 years in a Siberian gulag, where once again she would have been raped and brutalized. She survived, and she then had this amazing life back in Slovakia. I'm just going to see if there's any other questions about Lally before I start talking a little bit more about Silke. Nope, that'll do for Lally. Okay, let's move on to Silke. How could I tell her story? Now, yes, I did not have her permission because she died in 2004. But Lally had said to me many, many times, when you finish telling my story, you must tell the world about Silke. They need to know about her. And so that was part of my promise to him, was to also tell her story. Of course, he would always say, only after you've told my story. And so that's the way I did it. To be able to tell her story, not only did I speak to several survivors here in Melbourne who knew her and could tell me about the little bit they were prepared to tell me and the little bit that they knew. Lally knew more about it, and by the way, so did Gita, because Gita visited Slovakia to her brothers, and she visited Silke, and she stayed with Silke. And so she shared with Lally what Silke's life now was like back in Slovakia after surviving Siberia. So I had those two components. Now, I had researchers looking into Lally's story to confirm, professional researchers to confirm his story. And I'd said to them, look, can you also check on Silke Klein, find out what you can? And so once again, from written testimonies, I got more information about her. I had now a fairly good handle on what life was like in Auschwitz-Birkenau, didn't I? And I could place Silke there because people knew her there. What I was missing, of course, is what would her life be like in a Siberian gulag. And I knew that she had been in this one gulag the whole time, Vorkuta. So I engaged a professional researcher in Moscow to find out all the information you can for me about Vorkuta gulag. No other gulag. There's hundreds of them. I don't want to know about anything other than Vorkuta. And she got me documents and testimonies and photographs of Vorkuta gulag. And I was able to then be able to draw a picture together, the picture of what that gulag was like and what Silke's life in that gulag was like. But of course there was still her personal role there and her part in it that I couldn't get from a researcher. So what do I do? Well, simple. I go back to the country that I now call, well, my third home. I have two homes, Australia, New Zealand, and now a third home, Slovakia. I had been there several times, back to Lally's hometown of Krumpaki. Oh, so many stories I could tell you about being in Krumpaki. But I had, of course, made friends there. And Krumpaki is about an hour away from Košice, which is the largest, or second largest city in Slovakia. And I asked them, could you find anything you can about Silke? and anyone who knew her, because I knew she'd lived in Cosheta until her death. Well, of course, they did find me, neighbours and friends. And so back to Cosheta I went to spend time with the neighbours and friends of Silka, or as they knew her, Cecilia, because she was never known as Silka after she left Siberia. She stayed with her birth name, Cecilia. Now from them, they told me, many of them, they have little different aspects of her story, and they shared those with me. And that is how I was able to get her story of what she personally endured and survived in Vorkuta Gulag. And weave together that with the testimonies of other women who bravely told of what it was like for them in the women's part of that Gulag. Not only did I get to hear about from the people who knew Silka, or Cecilia, her time, but the amazing authorities and government departments in Slovakia, they started giving me access to, well, I suppose documents I really wasn't entitled to. But I got to see Silka's birth registration, her sisters, her parents, marriage details, death details of members of her family. I got to then get a picture of where she was in this family. I then went from that small town of Sabanov to Bardizhov, where she lived and was living until the day she was taken away. I got to see her school records for about the last 2 or 3 years of her life, of her schooling rather, because her schooling was cut short, wasn't it? Purely because of her religion. But I can tell you that she was very good at maths and science, and she was also a very well-behaved pupil. I got to stand outside the house, the home that she was taken from. It's still there. Look at the door that she would have ran through. Look up at the windows and above, and wonder which one of the 2 bedroom windows above were the room that she would have shared with her sisters. I then got to go to the synagogue where she and her family would have gone to pray. The old synagogue she went to, it's in ruins now, and there's a newer one beside it. And meet people there who could tell me about life of the Jewish people in Bardizhov up until she was taken away. So that's how I was able to weave her story together and tell her story. And it's a pretty amazing story, isn't it? How can this person survive these 2 horrors? But she knows her friends and her neighbours, even with, they didn't know much, by the way, about her time in Auschwitz-Birkenau. They just really knew about her time in Vorkuta. But they described to me this amazingly beautiful, not just physically, but this compassionate, loving woman. And every one of them would say to me, she loved us all, and we loved her in return. I was sitting in a room, the neighbours of her, Mr. and Mrs. Samueli, they'd been neighbours of her and her husband for, I think, about 40 years. And many other neighbours came into the room. They all knew that this funny lady from Australia was visiting and wanted to talk about Cecilia. Come down, knock on the door, come in and share your knowledge and your time with Cecilia. Men and women in their 40s and 50s who are now telling me, she was our second mother. When we were children and we would come home from school, and if we were locked out of our apartment, and particularly in winter, then Cecilia, she was there outside, and she would pick up these children, take them into her apartment, give them warm drinks, keep them warm. And their parents knew where to find them when they came home from work, being cared for by Cecilia, their second mother. Because sadly, she had no children of her own. And I can say sadly because Mrs. Samueli, 93 years of age, told me how much she had wanted to have a family, but it wasn't to be. So from them, I was able to find and hopefully paint to you this picture of this beautiful young girl who became a beautiful woman, who became this loving woman, so in love with the man that she met in Vorkuta, and the wonderful life that they shared together. You know, Mr. and Mrs. Samueli and the others, they told me that really she died of a broken heart because her husband had died 2 years before her, and from that moment on, Cecilia was never the same. And like Lally, she just craved to be with the person she loved the most. So that was how I was able to tell and write Silke's story. Now I've got another book coming out. I'm going to give you a little heads up. I've been chatting now for, quite a while, haven't I? Yeah, no, my family say I could probably speak underwater. Well, I've tried, and I can't. So yeah, I'm putting that out there. But the next story, or the next book that I'm writing it because I have to write it, because you the readers out there, you compelled me to write this book, because you have written to me in your thousands telling me how much Lally's story, and more lately, of course, Silke's story, has meant to you, and the sense of hope you have taken from their survival. And for many of you who've shared with me your own story of something tragic or traumatic, and how in trying to cope with that, you have found hope to carry on through Lally's story. I could spend another 10 sessions telling you of these amazing emails and letters I've received from readers around the world, telling me about what they have taken from Lally's story. So what have I done? Well, I have written another book. Now this is the cover of it. This is not the book because it hasn't been printed yet, has it? But it's going to be. In fact, only about an hour ago when I woke up, I got the message from my publisher in London to say the proofreaders have just finished with the story. Stories of hope. This is my telling you the stories that have come to me of hope from many, many people. Now, it's non-fiction. I'm writing, telling you how I have got these stories because I listened. And I'm trying to drill home the whole notion of listening. And if you listen, truly listen, actively listen to your friends, your family, you can hear stories, or they will tell you stories which mean so much to them. All you have to do is listen. I start off by telling you how the person I remember listening to the most was in fact my great-grandfather. He lived 2 paddocks away from me when I was a girl growing up, and I used to stop off and see him after school every afternoon and sit on the veranda, his back veranda with him. And Girlie, he called me Girlie, he would greet me, Girlie, come sit, and he'd pat the chair beside him. And he would tell me about his life. He was also, like Lally, a man well into his 80s. But from him, and of course the people I met working at the hospital and hearing their stories, well, they were telling me their stories which were immediate. They related to often a person lying in a bed who may or may not come back to them. Listening, telling stories of hope. So that's what's coming out in September. Now I get to tell you that you can pre-order a signed copy of this book from, once again, those amazing indie booksellers. Bookish, Forum, Lingham, Booker. I'm going to be arranging to have signed copies of this available, and you can pre-order them when they get around to putting that tag up. I'm not sure if they have yet. But that's it, folks. Stories of hope. And by the way, now that that one is about ready to go to the printers, I'm just going to briefly tell you about the 4th book. It will be my trilogy of stories around survivors. And I am so, so proud to be able to tell you this next story. Okay, it's going to be not available to you, because I actually haven't started writing it yet. Well, it's not quite true. I've got the story. And it'll be out in September 21. And I have the story because a woman saw my book, a woman who lives in Israel. She was 93 years of age when she looked at the cover, the Australian cover that her son had carried from Canada to visit his mom, saw the numbers on the arms and said to her son, "That must be about Lali and Gita." And she knew, because she saw Gita's number, and she knew that the number on her arm was only 3 away. And she knew that her sister Sibby's number was 2 away from Gita's, because she knew Gita and she knew Lali. And her third sister, these 3 young girls, 15, 17, 19, taken on that same train as Gita was from the same town. Lali numbering them. This amazing story of 3 young girls. Happy to tell you, not only did they all survive Auschwitz-Birkenau, 2 of them are still alive in Israel, and I've visited them most recently just in January this year. They're now 94 and 96 years of age. The older sister, she died a couple of years ago. But her family are there to tell me her side of the story. And of course the 2 surviving and girls, women, ladies, they are beautiful, beautiful ladies. And oh my gosh, I love being there and spending time with them and hearing their story. And you're going to hear about it too. So let's get your stories of hope. And then 12 months later, we'll follow up with untitled book yet, but it will be the story of the 3 sisters. Somebody's already pinched that title, so I'll have to come up with another. Now, I suspect there may be some questions in some of the comments I'm seeing running down the side of my screen here. But bear with me, and I'll put my glasses on and see if 1 or 2 of them jump out at me. But I'm not seeing questions. I'm seeing some lovely, lovely comments, and thank you. Hopefully I've answered many of your questions. I'm hoping I've told you not necessarily about the books, the content of the books, because they stand alone. But to me, getting these stories and telling them is what I like to talk to you about. Because if I can get them, you can too. You can too. All you have to do is listen to somebody. It could be your neighbour, and I'm not saying that you've got a story that you can turn into a full-length novel, but you'll know a story that you didn't know before if you listen. Look in your local newspaper. I have another story. I've written it as a screenplay. It hasn't gone anywhere else yet. But it was as simple as me reading a tiny little story, or it was a sentence at the end of a news story several years ago. It was about the Olympic Games. I'm really going off track here, aren't I? But it was the Olympic Games were coming up. I can't even remember which one it was. And at the bottom of this story here in Australia, they were talking about the extent of security needed these days for Olympic Games. Immense, isn't it? It's like protecting prime ministers and presidents' time, however many athletes there are. But at the bottom of this story about the Australian athletes going and the security they needed was a one sentence that said, "This is a far cry from the 1956 Olympic Games that were held here in Melbourne, where the security there was managed by one young man. He was only 23 at the time, and it gave his name." Well, my brain went, wow, if he was only 23 then, he might still be alive. Well, guess what? I found him. And yes, he was an elderly man. And after many, many months of visiting him, he wouldn't talk to me initially because he'd been in military intelligence, okay? And keeping secrets is what his life had been about. And it took me many months of just going and seeing him on Sunday afternoons. And once again, he was quite happy to have my company and just talk to me and say, "No, I can't tell you that. No, I can't tell you that." And then one day he said, "It's more than 50 years. I know you can access certain documents through our ASIO, our Secret Intelligence Office. Why don't I tell you what really went on?" And he did. And I have had that story of the lies, the spies, the murders and abductions in 1956 in Melbourne. But that was because I read this one sentence at the end of another story and went looking. So I come back to it. If I can do it, you can do it. You just have to want to, of course, and you may not want to. Look in your local newspaper, talk to a neighbour, find a friend who's got an elderly relative. The reality is, come on, it's going to be someone who's lived some of their life that are going to have these amazing stories. But let me come back to stories of hope for those of you out there who are saying, I've had something like that happen to me, that I've found hope in the sun coming up, the first sounds of my grandchild being born, the smile on my baby's face when I've been in a dark place. Because hand in hand with this book coming out, already out there now is a website, yourstoriesofhope.com. And on that website, I am inviting you to go to the tab that says Submit. Write a short story, a longer story, write any story. If you have a story where you have been touched by an event and needed to find strength from somebody, something, to be able to put the smile back on your face again, then why don't you write it up? Submit it. My publishers will get it. It won't go live, by the way. Don't think it's just going to go straight onto the website. It won't. It will go to my publishers, and they'll be in touch with you, and they will ask you if you'd like some help, maybe editing it a bit, and with your permission, would you like it to then be put onto the website? Because that's what we're looking for now, and offering to you a chance to write your own story of hope, and if need be, put it out there for the world to read. Or it may just be cathartic for you to write it and then submit it to somebody else, one of these amazing publishers at Bonnier Zafra, who can then read it and get back in touch with you. And by the way, I'd love to read it too, and I will be reading everyone that comes that way. So that's what's going on with me. And as soon as Qantas can fly again, and this is my main criteria, I have been vaccinated, I will once again travel. I should be in Europe right now. That's where I was meant to be. I was meant to have flown into Milan about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and from there be currently travelling around Europe, and particularly the UK and over into Ireland. I will be back. I will get there. And I will hopefully get to meet as many of you as I can, because there's nothing I love more than actually being out there in the wild, talking with you, being with you. I've probably overstayed my welcome to those lovely people who invited me here. And by the way, I need to also acknowledge, I'm so sorry, I should have done this sooner, how humbled I am to be one of the 5 finalists in the British Book Awards. Oh my goodness. Yeah, to be there with those other 4 authors. Come on, Margaret Atwood, who gets mentioned in the same sentence as her. I'm delighted, humbled, and I thank you. I thank you for tuning in, or what are the appropriate phrases for watching a live event on Facebook. This is all very new to me to be doing this, but it's the way of the world, isn't it? Thank you again. Or as they say in Slovakia, Ďakujem. Ďakujem. Thank you. Good evening to you. I will now go and make a cup of tea and let my day begin. Farewell.